Hi, I'm Nikolai, aka 56 Miner, and today we'll be unboxing our September premium box. This month's box is all about watercolor markers. We'll talk about some different ways to use the mediums, go over some basics of floral illustration, and I'll share some tips and tricks that I picked up on my art journey. Let's get into it. For our pad this month, we have the Harmony watercolor paper from Hanamule. This hot press paper is super smooth and absorbs a lot of water, which is perfect for watercolor mediums. For our brush this month, we have the SketchBox Signature Mop Brush in a 3/8 inch size. Mop brushes are great because they hold a lot of water and a lot of pigment. For sketching and outlines, we have the King Art Chisel Tip Pen in brown. Chisel tip pens offer a lot of versatility as you can create thin or thick lines, which makes them a great tool for hand lettering. This month, as a change of pace, let's use a floral theme to familiarize ourselves with our art supplies. Now there are a bunch of ways to draw flowers. Thin, simple flowers typically read as a little bit more elegant, while thicker and rounder flowers are a bit more friendly. Now while the style of a drawing is really personal preference, there are some foundations that'll make drawing flowers a little bit easier. Flowers with petals, for instance, typically have a symmetry to them. Regardless of how many petals a flower might have, it's usually just a circle divided in equal spaces. We can use that to draw them in side profile with an ellipse. An ellipse is just a fancy term for an oval, which we'll use for the opening of our flower, adding two lines in a cone shape to establish a base. From there, all we need to do is subdivide the space in order to create those petals. If you have a pencil or an erasable medium at home, you can definitely go in and put those guides first without going in with a permanent pen. I also love chisel tip pens for thumbnailing, which is when you just kind of work out simple ideas and shapes before committing too much time to a piece. It's a great way to flesh out a concept and to keep yourself from overcommitting too early. I also really enjoy pattern work with a chisel tip, so if you do journaling or anything like that, it's a great tool. Our next two items are going to be from Akashiya Sai. They're going to be a set of watercolor brush pens in pink and rose red. These brush pens are fun because they offer a lot of versatility. They're kind of a drawing medium, but you can also use them for large swaths of color. The bristle tip offers really thin lines or thicker marks, and the pigment is going to be slightly staining, so while it lifts up great with water, it won't completely come off the page. The pigment in these pens dilutes really evenly with water, and we can take these pens and brush them right onto our mop brush in order to get some of that pigment. This allows us to create some very subtle transitions, which is perfect for floral illustration. There's not much harsh color, as everything's kind of a soft gradient with flowers. I really like the brown of the King Art pen with the pink. I think it's just a really nice, simple color palette. You can also layer these brush pens to create a more darker or saturated color. Our next item is from the Akashiya Sai company as well, and it's going to be the Thinline brush in pine green. Just like the name would imply, this is going to be a thinner, more fine liner style brush pen. Working with a quick hand, you can get kind of a textured effect with these brushes. If you're looking for a smoother line, I'd suggest going with a slower pace so that ink can reach the page. By laying down some water first, we can play around with a blooming effect, which is a great way to create an abstract background or achieve a more classic watercolor aesthetic. Our next item is going to be the micro brush pen from Pentel. Now this is going to be an ink-based medium instead of a watercolor like our other brush pens. This brush pen comes with a super flexible nib and is great for thin or thick lines. Unlike a fine liner or chisel tip, these lines are going to have a lot of line weight variance to them, so a steady hand will always result in a steadier line. And by using just a little bit of water in our brush, we can create some fun watercolor effects and ink blooms, which is a great way to increase the value range in a piece. You'll definitely want to make sure that it's fully dry before going back in though, otherwise you won't be able to get those crisp edges. Ink pens can be tricky if you're not used to them. I typically find success by thinking in black and white because you're really working in a high contrast medium. I'm not really looking to create too many values. I'm more focused on the line and how it defines what I'm trying to represent. And while this footage is sped up, it's worth noting that I'm actually working pretty slow with this. I'm more partial to kind of a distinct line. Well, if you work at a fast pace with an ink brush pen, you can get some texture effects and some distressing that can be interesting. The next item in this month's box is going to be the Winsor Newton Watercolor Pro Marker in Burnt Umber. This marker comes with a bullet nib and a brush nib, and is filled with watercolor pigment that blends out really easily with water. While this marker is great on its own, I really enjoy it in combination with the King Art chisel tip, as it's just kind of a darker, cooler brown when compared to the warm brown of the liner. Using them together creates some nice value effects, and it's really easy to control it with that bullet nib. It's also a great complement to our pine green color, which would be great for succulents or pothos, any kind of plant life that has a lot of green to it. The Pro Marker also layers really well if you're looking to make consistent washes of color. Our next item is going to be the Faber-Castell watercolor marker in Indian Red. This marker comes with two nibs, a bullet nib, which is great for dot work and pointillism, and a brush tip that's similar to the Pro Marker. Using our brush, we can lift a little bit of that pigment off the marker and create more transparent washes. When illustrating multi-petaled flowers like carnations or roses, I typically find that it's best to go in and establish the overall shape, and then go back in and identify the darkest areas. This is a common technique for oil painters and really helps to take the guesswork out of things. I'll blend out some of that rose red color so that we can get more variance, and then go in with the Indian red in order to darken up those areas again. I really want this flower to have some bright red color, so I'm going back and forth between the Indian red and the rose red so that we can get the petal colors right, and then I'm going to come in once everything's dry and re-emphasize those shadows using a rich black, which we'll talk about in a minute. First, I'm going to go in with our pine green Thinline brush pen and establish some of the outlines and darkest areas of some leaves and stems to give our flower blossom a bit of context. With my first layer of green fully dry, I'll go in and add a bit of water so we can use a wet on wet technique in order to fill in those areas with color. If your brush tip runs out of pigment using this technique, no need to worry, just wait a moment and that pigment will flow back down the bristles. This is where that rich black comes back into play. For the shadows on the petals and the flower itself, I'm going to use that green color on top of the red, and that creates a rich black, opposed to kind of a traditional flat black. I'll add some shadow areas to our petals, and our rose is done. Try following along and draw your own. Now that we have a good understanding of our materials, let's go in and make something a little bit more complex, while sticking with our floral theme. Using one of the sheets from our pad, I'll create a line of symmetry, and I'm going to use this as the base of our flower. We'll create a few branch offs so we can get some visual interest. And then I'll go in and establish the base of the flower. Once that base is established, I can go in and add the petals, keeping in mind that petal structure that we talked about in the beginning of the video. I'm going to draw those petals freeform, but you can definitely go in and establish a guide. The reason why I'm going in freeform is because I want a little bit of movement and I want to work in a three-dimensional space. So I want the petals to look like they're bending towards me. Next, I'll add some more branch offs from our stem, just to kind of fill in that area a bit. Next, I'll add some details to our petal and draw in the stigma, so the center of the flower. And with that, the line art's pretty much done. By investing time in this stage of the process, we can save ourselves from a lot of frustration down the road. Taking a bit of that Indian red and some water, I'll go in and lay down a base layer of color on the petals. Using that Thinline brush pen for the stem and those branch offs. By using this over that King Art brown, we can kind of unify the colors in the piece and it'll make it look a little bit more balanced. Taking our Winsor Newton marker, I'll go in and create a sense of depth by adding a little bit of that pigment to the center and some of the edges of the petals. Using the Akashiya side brush pen, I'll add some red to the center and follow that up with the Indian red marker using that bullet nib to create some dimension in the center. With my petals fully dry, I'll go in with that Indian red on the petals again, which will help to push the contrast and sense of form in those petals. It's really important that you let each layer of pigment dry if you're trying to get more crisp edges, because the pigment's always going to want to go where there's water. So if you're working on a wet surface, you won't be able to achieve those crisp lines or separated colors. As a final touch, I'll go in with our Pentel micro brush pen and use it to separate just the darkest areas. I don't want to overwhelm the piece with black because we've got some great subtle transitions. And with that, our piece is complete. Hope you enjoyed the video, learned a few things, and if you post your work online, make sure you use #SketchBox September. We love seeing what y'all create each month. And I'll see you next month.